Okay, Rabotai, we're continuing on Siman Shin Yutet Halachot of Borer, and we left off one piece of Seif Tet Zayin from the previous shiur, and that is the Biur Halacha that talks about the Shita of the Maharit Zahalon, which we actually really discussed it, if you remember, in the very beginning of the Siman, the Be'er Hetev in Sif Katan Bet brings the words of Maharit Zahalon in Siman Resh Gimal of his Tshuvot. The Maharit holds that there is no Isur of Borer Belach. That means if you have a solid object mixed with liquid, they are so separate already in their nature that it's not considered halachically a problem of borer, and hence it will be mutar. That's the shita of Maharit. You remember we spoke about the Mahari Abu Lafia, that he holds that the four kulas that we discussed already, and again one of the big ones, which there are the Birkei Yosef, others who side with the Maharit Zahalon, that they are more lenient in that way, but at the same time, it's something that the Mishnah Berurah writes that it's very hard to be mekel, to be lenient, and at the end of the day, we mentioned that Chacham Obadiah in Chazon Obadiah in Shabbat Chelek Dalet, he uses a combination of things to be mekel. We mentioned the Mahari Abu Lafia that holds that at the time of eating there is no borer, because that's considered derech achila, when you separate and you eat right away, even if it's not mamash as you eat, but immediately as you eat, it's considered also not a scenario of borer. We spoke about the fact that the Taz and many other achronim, they mentioned that if you are taking something with some of the liquid out, like with a spoon and a little bit of the liquid with it, that would also be considered that you're taking bad and good together, so that will be also fine. And of course, the famous Mahari Hagiz, Rabbi Yaakov Hajiz, that he holds is something that is floating on top of liquid, that's like on top of the Maharitats. If it's not mixed inside the liquid, but if it's saf al gabav, if it's floating on top, says Rabbi Yaakov Hagiz, that will be also mutar. It's not, it's a binita michalba. You're taking something from on top of the water, and that's not considered borer either. So hence, all of this will be put to use in this biur halacha that we have in Seif Tet Zayin, the top Biur Halacha in Kuf Mem Gimel Amud Aleph, in the regular prints of Mishnah Berurah. He says, Katav Ataz ve'li Rabba v'chen katva Pri Migadim Mushar Achronim dekevan deve psolet mitoch ochel. This is a situation of psolet mitoch ochel, because again, remember, this is talking about בשעת שתייה, מעכב את הפסולת שלא ייכנס לתוך פיו, that the Shulchan Aruch allows, and says the Biur Halacha, ועיין בבאר היטב שהביא דמהרית צהלון מקל ונופל לתוך המשקה. If something falls inside, if something solid falls inside a liquid, then Maharit Zahalon is lenient. וראיתי בספר בית מאיר להסכים גם כן למהריתץ, that בית מאיר, one of the גדולי האחרונים, also agrees with Maharit Zahalon, וכטעמו המובאר בבאר היטב, and the reason is because there is אין ברירה בלח, there is no איסור בורר when you have a solid object mixed with liquid, ומכל מקום קשה מאוד להקל בזה. The psak of the Mishnah Berurah at the end of the day is very hard to be lenient and to rely on it, even though that the Beit Meir or the Gedolei HaPoskim sides with the Maharitats, still very difficult to be mekel, ubifrat de milta doraita. Especially, says the Mishnah Berurah, because this is an isur the Oraita. Now, as we mentioned, he's not alone. We have Eliyahu Rabbah, we have the Birkei Yosef side with this. But again, Chacham Obadiah, even with all of that, still says that someone that wants to rely only on Maharit Sahalon, yesh lo al ma lismoch, has what to rely on. But he really doesn't side with it in a serious way, because in the next page, in the same Chazon Obadiah, in Chelek Dalit of Shabbat, he writes that you can't rely on Maharit Sahalon unless you also have like Rabbi Yaakov Hajiz with it, that it's floating on top, like a bug that's on top, and you want to take it off. Fine. So you have the Mahari Hagiz, you have the Mahari Sahalon, then you could perhaps rely on it. But again, even there, he says best is to just throw in the Taz as well and take it with a little bit of the liquid, or put your hand there and let the bug crawl up. That's of course not in the case that's a wasp or a dangerous species, but then you have some liquid coming out with it as well, and you could be more lenient in that way. And sometimes you have Mahari Abdulafia as well. If it's something that you're about to drink right now, then that would be a little bit more lenient as well. Now, how about if you have the bugs dead on top and you want to blow at them and empty them out? So in that case, in the Sefer Tal Orot, he writes that is not so clear, because you remember the Mishnah in Masechet Shabbat writes that, and this is in Daf Kuf Mem Amud Aleph, that if you have, let's say, bugs, or the case of the Gemara is not bugs, but you have solid on top of liquid, and you want to add some liquid, and then the overflow basically takes the garbage out, that, says the Gemara, is Asur. So to do that with when you have wine and there's some bugs on top, and you want to just pour some water in and overflow and get rid of the bugs, that would be a problem. So how about blowing? You see, that now becomes a little bit better. So Sefer Tal Orot says not so simple. Not so simple if that would be considered mutar. But at the same time, if it's not borer, and this is Ma'ari Hagiz in Halachot Kanot, he says, if it's not borer, it's not zoreh either, is not so blowing at it, which would be equivalent of zoreh, also would not be there. Once you paskin like Ma'ari Hagiz himself, right, which he holds that if it's saf, if it's on top, it's not asur, and throw within it the Maharit Sahalon as well. So if it's not borer, then it's not zoreh either. But again, this is one of those things that is more questionable. It's always better to just take a spoon, take some of the liquid with it, and then do not tell anyone that there were bugs inside, because then they're going to be bal shaksu anyways, as we discussed before. So hence that would be probably the best way to go about it. Okay, now, and we already discussed the tea bags, right? The tea bags, now the problem, neither is a problem. The tea bag itself is solid and liquid, so you have the maharit, and it's floating usually, so you have the Mari Hagiz, but at the same time, it's also not a problem, writes Moshe Levi, the droplets of tea essence that come out, because you're not mechaven, you don't care about them, the tea is already made. But nevertheless, we mentioned before, still better to always do it with a kapit, with a spoon, as the Mishnah Berurah paskins in Shin Yud Chet, and as we discussed it both there and over here in our Siman as well. So with that, we're going to now close Sif Tet Zayin and enter the last Sif of this Siman, Sif Yud Zayin, HaMechabes, Toledet Borerhu Lefichach Afal Pi Shenotnim Shum Shemin. Mechabes is making butter, right? They would put the milk and shake it off in a leather pouch or in a kli that was miuchad lekach, and it would separate the fat from the rest of the milk. Usually was made for taking the butter or the chem'ah out of the milk, and that process of mechabes is toledet borer. You're separating things, even though that they're one goof beforehand. You don't really see the particles, but that's a toledah of borer, and therefore it's asur. And hence, says the Shulchan Aruch, lefichach afal pi shenotnim shum shemin, even though that they would put sesame seeds and also walnuts and different egozim, different nuts inside of dvash of honey. Lo yechabesem biyado. Don't separate them with your hand, because that will become a problem. And then the Ramah drops a bombshell over here of a concept that is very interesting and difficult to understand. The Ramah writes, once you're talking about borer, don't spit in the ruach. Don't spit when there is wind, and the wind is going to tear it apart and take it away, because that is very similar to the isur of winnowing of zoreh, when you take the mixture of tfu'ah and you winnow it, and to separate the shaft and the straw from the actual grain. And therefore, says the Ramah, chayav mishum zoreh. If you do that, you go to Geinam. Chayav. Right? He asks, he says, well, since when you become hayav? Like, even by zoreh, ala rishonot anu mistarim. Already the Gdolei Poskim ask a question, what zoreh is grama? They say, oh well, the kavanah is melechet machshevet, the kavanah is to separate, so even though that's grama, that's the essence of the work, and then it's asur, and then there's what are you metaken? So you're metaken the kri, the pile of the mix. So there is a lot to talk about that even, but over here you're spitting. You don't need any part of anything. Right? Of course, once we added, the Gemara in Chagigat Afei Amud Bet says, Harak bifnei chavero, if a person spits in front of his friend and v'katzba, and the friend becomes, disgusted with it, you have to give dim v'heshbon. That's a avera. You make someone megual. That's part of ben adam lehavero. And Pileyo, it's right. It's not only that. It's afterwards also. You could be gone for 2 hours, and someone passes by in the street and sees the mucus and gets disgusted. Even that is a problem. And it says sometimes a person could step on it and go flying, and and that becomes more of damages and so on. So again, without getting into too many graphical details of this, it's not a proper thing to do anyways in front of people, but this has a lot of nafkaminas for, if this is asur according to the Ramah, how about spraying on Shabbat? Right? Spraying, you want to have an air freshener, you want to have like poison sprays, deodorant, or they're bugs and you want to spray to shoo them away or kill them. You can't do it directly on them, of course, right? But is that also spraying in the air is much worse than this? So what's the halakha we have to discuss? So let's quickly get into this. Jump right in. We're discussing some of the details. Says the Ramah. Says the Ramah, you cannot spit in the air because it's zoreh. And now Mishnah Berurah explains the beginning of the seif that mechabes is when you take perush motzi chem'a min hachalav. You're separating the butter, the chem'a, the cream, off of the milk. So it says the Mishnah Berurah, v'chen halokach halav v'noten bo keva. The same would be if you put some stomach essence of the calf, which basically is rennet. You put rennet in the milk, and the whole thing turns into cheese. That would be the same isur, right? Says the Mishnah Berurah. Or you have like a sifter, like a sack, and you put the comb inside, and the water that's getting separated drips down, and you end up with either cheese or solid hardened yogurt. That also says because you're separating the water off the particles, and that's also a tolada of borer. Kol ze bichlal mechabes hu toledet borer. All of that is asur. Asur afiru al yedei eno Yehudi. Even if you want to ask the goy to do it, still asur. V'chen hakolet shuman asaf al penei hachalav. Same is when you want to gather the cream that is floating on top of the chalav, on top of the milk. Gam hu bichlal borer. That's also borer. This already you could imagine what's going to be said about it. Chazon Obadia in Chelek Dalet on page Resh Lamed Hey, he says that no, that's not asur, because we have the svara of Rabbi Yaakov Hajiz, we have the svara of Maritza Alon, of course, and therefore, of course, that would not be very simple. That would be asur, even though that there are those who disagree. But we have already these two serious shitas to rely on. But nevertheless, the Mishnah Berurah is machmir. Now, Rabbi Shaul, Harav Shalom, in his first, what he wrote himself, basically Chelek Aleph of Or Letzion, he discusses that this Mishnah Berurah of taking the chalav and separating it from the water that drips down, or making cheese, it really depends on the machloket achronim of what exactly is the essence of borer. Because when you put rennet in the milk and then the cheese forms, you didn't do any separation. In the same bucket, the things became separate from one another. That's what happened, right? That's what happened. But nothing more. I didn't take it and separate it from each other. It just separated by themselves inside the bucket, versus me taking out the bad or the good and separating it from each other. So, what same thing is with the mechabes, that when I separate this, in the leather pouch, and I shake it off, and the cream separates from the milk, it's all in the same kli. That happens, whether or not that is asur or not, that becomes really talui on that machloket. But for our purposes, of course, it would be asur to make cheese with rennet, or to make the cream or butter with doing a regular process of chibus, and that's a tolada of borer, which is a isur d'oraita. Now says Chafetz Chaim in the Mishnah Berurah, וכן הקולט שומן אסף על פני החלב, גם זהו בכלל בורר, על כן ייזהר כשיגיע סמוך לחלב, יניח קצת מן החלב, ואז שרי. And therefore, if you're separating from on top the cream from on top of the milk, you peel off from on top, and you leave a little layer of cream still, and that would be mutar, because again, you are not now taking the whole thing off, and that would be allowed, that would be permissible. Excuse me. Afilu da'ato la'altar, and that is, says the Mishnah Berurah, if you want to take the chalav or the cream and you leave a little bit off, afilu da'ato lechol la'altar, even if you want to eat it immediately, still it will be asur, because you're taking it with a kaf, you're taking it with the kli. Right? Even though that you're taking the good from the bad, you want to eat the cream. So you're taking the cream exactly from the chalav. If they would take the whole thing, says Chafetz Chaim, that would be asur. Because even though that I want to eat the cream, and is borer ochel mitoch psolet, you're taking the good from bad, which would be...
Why is it bad?
It would be mutar. Well, you don't want the milk right now. It's not bad, but it's what you don't want from the mixture, right? But even if you want ochel mitoch psolet, and you want to eat the ochel right now, which should be mutar, still says the Chafetz Chaim is asur. And this is one of the massive chidushim of the Chafetz Chaim, says, because you're doing it with a spoon. So you're doing it with a kli. And if you're doing it with a kli, we already learned In order for it to be mutar, it has to be meeting all three criteria. It has to be ochel mitoch psolet, it has to be beyad, it can't be with a vessel, with a kli, and it has to be miyad right beforehand, right? So here you're missing the second one of being beyad. Says the Chafetz Chaim, sheharehu lokeach bekaf. So this indicates that according to the Chafetz Chaim, according to the Mishnah Berurah, taking, separating with spoon is taka, a problem, right?
Isn't it all
Actually, if you take a look at the Shar Hatziyun over here in the bottom, on Ot Nun Chet, he explains that separating something with spoon is considered derech berera. It's considered a regular way of separation, and therefore it's asur, right? But at the same time, Chafetz Chaim himself, Mamash himself, later on in Sif Katan, this is Samech Bet, in Samech Vav, if you take a look, he himself brings the words of the Tosefta, and he seems to explain over here that's mutar to take the food that you want to eat that is thick and solid from the liquid that it is mixed with. You could take it with spoon to eat it, right? So it seems like a stira a little bit in the Mishnah Berurah himself, from Sif Katan Samech Bet to Sif Katan Samech Vav, right? So now Rav Moshe Levi alav Shalom in Chelek Bet of his Misefer Menuchat Ahava, he explains that's not stira. It really depends if you are eating with a spoon or if you're separating with a spoon, right? In other words, if I'm eating and I want this piece of potato or carrot, whatever, and I'm taking it out of the soup to eat it, even though that I separated good from bad with a spoon, because as I eat, right, without getting into the technicalities of Maria Bulafia and it's mutar. But if I'm taking it to put it in the next thing to separate and keep it separated, that already, even though that I want to eat in 5 minutes, so it's kind of like part of my eating, that, says the Menuchat Ahava, it becomes what's problematic according to the Mishnah Berurah, according to the Chafetz Chaim, right? But at the same time, the Or Letzion, Rabbi Sion Abba Shaul, Alav Shalom, and Igrod Moshe also, in Chelek Aleph of his Tshuvot, Siman Kuf Chaf Dalet, they both say the reason that the kaf, the spoon, is mutar to use for separation is because you are not really helping the separation much. You could do it with the hand. Like if we would be feeling like Avotenu HaKadoshim in the cave ages and stone ages and so on, we would just put this spoon away and take it with the hands, sometimes even easier. The reason we use this spoon is because we are sophisticated individuals and we don't want to dirty our hands or dirty our food, right? That's why we use a spoon to separate, but it's not a kli that makes it easier to be borer. And says Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, hence it's mutar to separate things with spoon because it doesn't really help. Even fork, he says the same thing.
Well, if it's like a soup, then we don't have that far.
Of course you can. You put your hand in the soup and you take the thing out and you eat it. Well, it's like,
the liquidy part, let's say?
no, you're taking a solid out of liquid. That's the case.
But
It's the case. That's not separation. You're just taking, the whole thing is soup. Right? So that's the Svara of Rav Moshe Feinstein. Now, the Chazon Obadia, Harav Obadia, in Chelek Dalet, on page Kufayin Gimel, Kufayin Dalet, he says that that's not a problem altogether. You don't even need to come to the Svara of the Or Letzion and Igrod Moshe, because spoon is not a kli that's made for brera. It's not. It's a kli that's made for eating. It's not a vessel that's made to separate things from one another, and therefore it's mutar. Right? That's the main svara. That so even if it helps you and it makes it easier, that you don't really have Rav Moshe Feinstein in that case, still is mutar, says Rav Obadia, because it's not a kli that's made for creating borer, but it is rather something to. Now that makes a difference when you have the spoons that are made for soup and vegetables and so on, serving spoons that they have holes inside, right? So they are made to actually separate and take the solids out of liquid. So put aside, of course, the Maharitza Halon and the Rabbi Yaakov Hajiz's Svara, that becomes a problem. The Sefer of Mirchat Ba'ava, Sefer of Moshe Levi alav shalom, he's machmir. He says you cannot use that on Shabbat. You cannot use what do they call them? The serving spoons with the hole inside. There's a name for it. I'm blocking the name, but everyone knows what I'm talking about. So you cannot use those on Shabbat. Period. Finished. Right?
But if you use the fork, which normally isn't used for that purpose, to take like noodles out of a soup, then it's no issue because it's not normally used to separate. The spoon with the slit in it to take the noodles out would be a problem because the soup goes through, but if you're using a fork, which normally would not be used.
Yeah, fork is fine, because fork is not made for brera. That's what the Ramosha, for instance, says, Harav is the same thing, right? It's made for eating, even for serving, it's like, not for separation. But this is made for separation. It's a clear. Mirchat Ava writes that you're chayav d'oraita. Even if you're doing it in process of eating, right before you eat, you are using a kli that's miyuchad for borer to sift through good and bad, even though that you're taking good from bad, right? Now, the Or Letzion allows this. The Or Letzion says, well, you're taking what's good from bad because we pass, you remember, what stays on top is what you are separating. So you're separating good from the mixture. And says, but at the same time, the Mirchat Ava makes a lot of sense as well over here, because Mirchat Ava says, at the end of the day, even if you're borer ochel mitoch psolet, you're using a kli that's made for berera. Rabbi Shaul seems to say that, it's not really made for berera because some liquid stays anyways. Of course, one would probably think that the more sensible svara is the svara of Moshe Levi alav shalom, because even if you leave some soup inside, really you're using this kli because you don't want the soup. Now, even if you get stuck with some of the soup, or if you don't mind some of the soup, but you don't want a lot of soup, if you would be ladling it out, it would be very uncomfortable. So you are actually using it for berera, and therefore it will be a problem. Even though that Rabbi Tzchak Yosef Shlita, he seems to take the side of the Or Letzion and be more mekel and try to add it that you're not makbid that the entire soup should go out, and doesn't go out, so to speak, and he seems to suggest that his father Harav Shlomo Yisraeli also agreed with that. So certainly there is what to rely on to use those vessels, but it's very kedai to stay away from using those because it's extremely sensible what the Mirchat Ava says, that you really don't want it. If you're putting that, unless you don't have any other serving spoons, right? If you have other ones and you're using this badavka, it means that you don't really want the gravy or the soup mixed, then you want to take the solids out, and that's a kli that's certainly made for brera. It's a specific kli made for serving that is different than the other ones in this way, that it separates and takes out the soup that you don't want. So you're actually using something that's made for brera. So it's very, especially because you're dealing with the doraita, and it is a very sensible svara. I think la new dati is kedai to be machmir, even though that you have the Or Letzion, you have Harav Yitzchak Yosef Shalita, we have Harav Ovadia, seems to be alav shalom, but certainly is kedai to be machmir when possible. Now, there's one important thing. If you take a look at the Mishnah Berurah in Sif Katan Samech Gimal, right, that it says this is toledet borer, when you are mechabes, when you separate the butter from the milk by shaking off in this pouch, is toledet borer. It's offshoot of the melacha of borer. Umechlal ze hama'amit chalav b'makom cham k'tei shtase gevina. Same as if you wrap your milk and you put it in a warm place to make it gvina. Now he calls it gvina. Some people do that in order to make yogurt, really, right? Says the Mishnah Berurah, that's also asur. And we're talking about Mishnah Berurah seemingly saying that this is isur deoraita of a toledet borer, right? And then he says that if you take lokeach kom ve'oseh gvina chayav mishum boneh. If you make gvina, if you make cheese, then you are also building. You're chayav mishum boneh. You're building, because boneh, the way Rambam explains the melacha of boneh. By the way, you have to understand that boneh is one of the hardest sugyas in Shabbat to learn, as far as the lomdut is concerned. Is one of the most lomdish, more complex and sophisticated sugyas of Shabbat is boneh. So the way Rambam the Tosafot explain the isur of boneh is putting small particles together and building something bigger from smaller particles is a melacha of boneh, right? So therefore, when you take the particles of milk and you put them together, build it as one block of cheese, that is toledet boneh, right? By the way, this becomes, according to the Shita of Tosafot, this becomes a very interesting thing, speaking about halachot of Yom Tov, because we paskin in halachot Yom Tov that mitoch shehutra lesorech is also hutra shelo lesorech. Right? Anything that's sorech ochel nefesh is mutar. So when it's not sorech ochel nefesh is also mutar. So therefore, if it's mutar to make givina lesorech ochel nefesh on Yom Tov, if it would be mutar, which is the isur of binyan, really on Yom Tov, according to the Shita of Tosafot, you should be able to build a house if it's sorech k'tzat, the baby paskin, because it's the same toladat. So this is like a serious thing. It's not just some homiletic things. Surah binyan, you're talking about. So that's what the Chafetz Chaim says here. Mishum boneh yur chaya mishum boneh shkol hamekabes chelek el chelek. When you bring the particles together, put them together, build them together, attach them together, make a block of something bigger from the small particles, until it becomes one piece. According to Rambam, that becomes this essence of melechet boreh, and hence it will be, of course, a big problem. Right now, the Ben Ish Chai paskins this Mishnah Berurah, the initial Mishnah Berurah that we just did in Seif Katan Samach Gimel in the beginning, that if you put milk in a warm place, right, making cheese or making yogurt from it, it will be asur. And therefore, he writes the Ben Ish Chai in Parashat Beshalach, right, in the second year, Shana Shniya, in Seif Yutet Al Chaf, that making yogurt on Shabbat, by putting it in a hot place, in a warm place, you will end up yourself in a very warm place, because that will become a isur of boneh. Again, it's isur of borer at least, right? But the problem is, he himself in his Tshuva Sefer, in Tshuvot Rav Ba'alim, in Chelek Dalit of his Tshuvot in Orach Chaim, Siman Tetvav, and also in Ben Ish Chai in Parashat Chayei Sarah, right? He writes that that's mutar. It says mutar to make on Shabbat leaven. Leaven is yogurt. So is it mutar or is it asur? It seems like a little bit of a stira. The Kaf HaChaim, who was a student of the Ben Ish Chai initially, before he went to Eretz Yisrael, he was a student of the Ben Ish Chai. He writes that because the derech berira is in this way, that you put it and it separates and so on, it becomes like nafa v'kvara and it's asur. So he takes sides with the Ben Ish Chai that we mentioned initially in Parashat Beshalach, that it is asur. Now, Harav Vadia, Alav Shalom, he asks a fundamental question on the whole thing when you talk about yogurt. It says, I don't get it. What's the problem of borer over here? When you put milk and it turns into yogurt, what happens? The whole thing turns solid. Right? There's no borer. The whole thing becomes hard. Right? Now, really that depends, I guess, what you use for your initial thing that you mix with it and how you put it, because not always the whole thing turns. If you're really good at it, yes, you could make the whole thing solid, and you won't have watery mixed with it. But sometimes you'll end up with water. So it really depends. Maybe that's what the Ben Ish Chai meant. Maybe different times are different. The way the time of Ben Ish Chai worked maybe was a little different. But again, Harav Shlomo Yisraeli in Shabbat Chalek Dalet, he's tameach, and the whole Ben Ish Chai says, I don't get it. What borer? The whole thing turns solid. That's mutar. What do you want from my life, right? And he paskins that's mutar, right? So that's. But he says he actually tries to understand this. He says maybe Ben Ish Chai paskins like his own shita in a different place in Rav Pe'alim in Chelek Aleph. The Ben Ish Chai paskins that there is a isura makeh bepatish by ochalim. You know that? When you finish a job, it's makeh bepatish. When you're finishing a kli, it's makeh bepatish. That's the normal isur. Do we have isura makeh bepatish by ochalim? Your food, you finish a food, right? That becomes asur. Do you have such a isur? The Ben Ish Chai holds that yes, right? This is in Chelek Aleph of the Ben Ish Chai in Rav Pe'alim, Chelek Aleph, or Achaim, Siman Tet Zayin, I believe it is. He says it is asur because of makeh. So says Chachamad, yeah, that's what he means. Because when you finish the yogurt, you just build yogurt. You just made yogurt. It was milk, and now it's abracadabra, and you have yogurt. So maybe that's why he's machmir, because of makeh patish. He still doesn't explain really the stira, but of course, he does not pass like that. The majority of achronim do not hold that there is makeh patish by ochalim, and therefore it's mutar. Excuse me. So that's as far as makeh patish and yogurt is concerned, but by cheese, it's a little bit different, right? The Rav Pe'alim himself brings machloket rishonim concerning making cheese on Shabbat, if it's chayav min Torah, or is it maybe just the Rabbanan, right? The Chafetz Chaim, to me, the language sounded like it is a chiyuv d'oraita, right? Because he says chayav mishum boneh. That's the language of the Chafetz Chaim. The Ben Ish Chai is not so quick about this, and he holds that if you hold that there is no binyan be'ochalim midoraita, those according to those Rishonim, then it's only the Rabbanan, and that would be subject to machloket Rishonim, says the Chafetz Chaim, says the Ben Ish Chai. Now, one more piece here in the Mishnah Berurah before we go further. Lefichach, says the Shulchan Aruch, you should not be separating the nuts and the sesame seeds from the mixture that they have been mixed and blended together with dvash, with honey. You should not take them out with your hand. In that way, even though that is mutar to put, even though that's mutar to put the sesame seeds and the nuts inside the inside the mixture with dvash, but you cannot take them out, says the Chafetz Chaim, and it says lo yechabesem beyado, rotze lomar lo yekabesem beyado. You should not gather them and take them out with your hand, lehafrid otam min advash, to separate them from the honey. And he says that Tosefta brings אבל מחבס הוא מעשה כדרה ואוכל, ורוצה לומר להפריד בכף מאכל עבה מן הרוטב דמותר, which is the Mishnah Berurah that I brought to you earlier on, that with spoon you could separate them and eat them right away, which is the indication that spoon, at least when you're right away eating it, it's not really a problem, and it would be, it would blind a heter, it would become mutar. And that's what the Chafetz Chaim paskins over here as well. And if you want to do it right away, according to this Mishnah Berurah, if he say im da'ato le'echol altar shari lechabes beyado. Says the Mishnah Berurah in this Sif Katan Samech Dalet that if you want to do it right away, it will be mutar because not borer. לפי זה אם דעתו לאכול לאלתר שלי לחפש בידו, ועין במגן אברהם שהביא מהתוספתא ראיה דאיסור הוא משום לש, לפי זה אפילו דעתו לאכול לאלתר אסור. So Mishnah Berurah brings a little bit of a machloket over here, whether or not it's isur lash or not, and that has an afkamina whether or not it will be mutar to do it when as you're about to eat it. Now, let's just talk a little bit about this spitting of the Ramah. There's more to say about the previous piece, but just out of time right now, so it's just a minute about this. Mefazer Harok, if you take a look at Samech Zayin, Sif Katan Samech Zayin, the Mishnah Berurah, it says, V'lo ra'inu misha choshesh laze. Nobody is machmir like this. Even though that the Ramah says you're chayav, it seems like it says Chafetz Chaim. Everyone, if actually you go to Hasidei Chabad, whenever they say lahev ulrik, they spit, right? They actually used to have the
Spittoon.
spittoons in their shuls, but now that they took them away, you certainly do not want your kids to be playing on the ground in a Chabad house. Ask a question, a shaila from your local Orthodox doctor, whether or not you should be doing that. A lot of nicotine and a lot of other things could be on the ground. It could be really dangerous. But so as far as the Gemara in Chagigat that we mentioned earlier, if they're not really actually having a spit on the ground, just pretending it, that would be mutar. And again, there are two reasons that the Hasidei Chabad do such a thing. Nevertheless, that certainly is their minhag. But says the Chafetz Chaim, Lo ra'inu misha choshesh laze. Nobody cares about this. No, everyone does it. Kevan de'eno mitkaven lekach, because you have no kavanah for it. V'chol shken de'en ze derech zoreh, and certainly is not a way you winnow, or you're winnowing your spit. Oh, come on, it's not a problem whatsoever. Says the Chafetz Chaim. So therefore, you don't have to be really concerned about it. And the Maran Chida in Birkei Yosef writes the same thing. In the name of Mahari Kash, that nobody really cares about this. He brings it in the name of his grandfather, Maria Azulai, Mahara Azulai, Rabbi Avraham Azulai, his grandfather. Even though that the Ben Ish Chai actually brings this halacha of the Ramah, right? For all the Baghdadi Iraqi guys in the crowd, right? The Ben Ish Chai Taka brings this Ramah. It's a pele, And in Parashat Pekudei, in Sif Yud Aleph, he says that is asur midrabanan. He says, even though the Ramah seems to say it's chayav, it's doraita, the Ben Ish Chai says it's midrabanan, and you should not do it. The Or Etzion tries to finagle with the Ramah and explain it, but at the end of the day, certainly it's not the minhag to be machmir. And that being said, is mutar to spray on Shabbat the air fresheners and all the other sprays, because again it's not the derech zoreh bekach, it's not certainly the kavanah. You're not separating anything from anything. You're just trying to spit or spray, and that will be fine halachically speaking. B'ezrat Hashem will pick up the next siman. This ends up Mazal Tov. This ends up basically the whole long and important siman Shin Yutet of the complicated and important halachot of Borer. And B'ezrat Hashem will have a test for those who are opting for the test for the Bechina, and will continue on the next shiur in the days to come.